Sometimes the truth has a price. That may be the lesson of a Virginia police officer who says in trying to do the right thing, he ended up paying for it. Of one man who confronted truth and consequences.
This is the Truth and Consequences podcast with Doug Poppa.
As our officers get up onto the stairwell, there's an L-shaped metal bracket that was used by the suspect to keep the officers from being able to open the fire escape door, which is where they would have entered in. So as they get that door breached, the shooting stops.
From Las Vegas, Nevada, this is episode 80 for January 2nd, 2022. Many of you may not know that I authored approximately 165 articles for the Baltimore Post-Examiner on the October 1st, 2017 Las Vegas Massacre, more than any other single journalist in the country. I broke one story after another, many which were never covered by the Las Vegas media, and often appeared on radio and television news shows discussing my work. The news clip you just watched from 2019 was then Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department Undersheriff Kevin McMahill, who at the time was the second-ranking officer under Clark County, Nevada Sheriff Joe Lombardo, who runs the Las Vegas Metro Police Department. The Fox News Network's Fox Nation aired that interview with McMahill as part of their story on the October 1st, 2017 Las Vegas Massacre that aired on October 1st, 2019, 2 years after the massacre, which was the worst mass shooting in modern American history and the largest homicide investigation in the history of the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department. 2 years after the Las Vegas Massacre, Undersheriff Kevin McMahill still could not get his facts straight and tell the truth to the public. McMahill duped the public and Fox News as well by portraying a false narrative during that interview. In simpler terms, McMahill lied. That's exactly what it was, folks, a total all-out lie. McMahill's comment was bad enough at the time, but even worse now, since McMahill, who retired in December of 2020, is currently a candidate for sheriff of Clark County, Nevada. McMahill's former boss, Clark County Sheriff Joe Lombardo, is currently a candidate for governor of Nevada. Both Lombardo and McMahill have serious credibility issues, to say the least, have lied to the press many times, and both are complicit in multiple police department cover-ups, several which I have exposed when I was writing as an investigative journalist for the Baltimore Post-Examiner, and more recently, starting in May 2020, on my new forum for my independent investigative journalism work, the podcast you are watching now, Truth and Consequences with Doug Poppa. Let's revisit what Kevin McMahill said, quoting from McMahill's interview on Fox. There's an L-shaped metal bracket that was used by the suspect to keep the officers from opening the fire escape door, which is where they would have went in. So luckily, one of our SWAT officers, Levi Hancock, had self-deployed. He had a tool that allowed him to defeat the L-shaped bracket, and so, as they get that door breached, the shooting stops. Let me say that again. And so, as they get that door breached, the shooting stops. Like I said, that statement by McMahill was not true. McMahill, the number 2 man in command of the Las Vegas Metro Police at the time, did not know when the shooting stopped, 2 years after the massacre. He most certainly did. It was all about public image for the police department. Here's the truth, folks. Stephen Paddock stopped firing sometime between 10:15 p.m. and 10:16 p.m. on October 1st, 2017, way before Levi Hancock had even entered the stairwell. Hancock and his ad hoc team of patrol officers arrived into the 32nd floor stairwell just a few minutes shy of 11 o'clock p.m. on October 1st, 2017. They breached the stairwell door a few minutes later. There was no gunfire going on, folks. And then they did the explosive breach on Paddock's suite at 11:20 p.m., over 1 hour after the last shots were fired. It was extremely disturbing that Fox News didn't verify what McMahill had said. McMahill presented a false narrative to the public, once again, as to the events that happened that night. If you recall, I reported back in October 2017 that McMahill had told the press at that time that they couldn't make entry into Paddock's suite until the full SWAT team arrived. As I pointed out then, the full SWAT team never arrived. Then McMahill said on Fox News, quote, "And what we try to do in those situations, if there's people actively being killed, it doesn't matter. We train to go through the door." Well, if that was the case, if you remember, then why did Las Vegas Metro Police Field Training Officer Cordell Hendricks and Officer Ella Vossen, along with 3 armed Mandalay Bay assistant security managers, all retreat on the 31st floor for well over 4 minutes, while people were being killed and made no attempt at all to reach the shooter just 1 floor above? In a story that I wrote for the Baltimore Post-Examiner, I pointed out that Lombardo said armed security are a force multiplier for the police. So, 5 armed personnel did nothing as lives were being lost and casualties were piling up that night. In addition to that armed contingent, on the 32nd floor, while Paddock was firing, there was also the Mandalay Bay armed security operations manager, along with 2 armed security bike patrol officers, who also made no attempt to save lives. A total of 8 armed personnel in the vicinity of Paddock's suite, and nobody even attempted to do anything. What did Fox News have to say about Hendricks and all those armed officers? Nothing. Absolutely nothing. Never mentioned it in the 1 hour and 30-minute documentary. Hendricks's name and his failure to act never came up. Then McMahill, commenting on why it took so long to enter Paddock's Mandalay Bay Hotel suite, said, quote, "They're very reluctant to go in when there's nobody being killed at that particular point." Really? Because that is the opposite of what Sheriff Lombardo said 1 month after the massacre during his November 2nd, 2017 interview with George Knapp of KLAS-TV's 8 News Now I-Team. Lombardo told Knapp, quote, "In this case, because of what the suspect did, officers made the decision to breach this doorway of the hotel room in case the guy was reloading. Maybe he was reloading magazines. We didn't want to give him the opportunity to keep firing." The problem with that statement, folks, was nobody made entry into the suite until well over 1 hour. So where was the concern for the public safety, as Lombardo stated? Lombardo was never challenged by Knapp on that. Knapp went on to another question. During the McMahill interview on Fox, he then said, quote, "I don't think anybody would believe that when we went into that room that we would find a 64-year-old white man be responsible for this." Why not, McMahill? White men have committed more mass murder throughout American history more than any other race. ATF Special Agent Jill Snyder also appeared in the documentary. Snyder said, quote, "I will never forget that day. I walked into the room. There was a blood stain on the floor where he shot himself. Thousands of empty shell casings." Let me repeat that again. Thousands of empty shell casings. Really? Thousands of empty shell casings? Well, because according to the Las Vegas Metro Police's final criminal investigative report, they recovered approximately 1,050 .223 expended cartridge casings from room 32-135, not thousands. Mandalay Bay security officer Jesus Campos was only mentioned briefly in the Fox documentary as being shot in the leg. No mention was made as to why Campos, after observing the L bracket drilled into the fire stairwell door and jamb, then heard drilling noises inside Paddock's suite, just walked away without ever investigating or calling that in. That will go down as the worst case of security negligence in the history of the hotel casino industry. On October 8, 2017, the Baltimore Post-Examiner broke the story that was titled, "Las Vegas Police Borrowed Armored Vehicles from Private Company." In that story, I wrote that the LVMPD borrowed armored vehicles from Battlefield Vegas, a company that provides customers with the opportunity to fire fully automatic weapons and owns a fleet of surplus military vehicles. At the time, the LVMPD and Battlefield Vegas refused to comment when I asked. A representative of Battlefield Vegas appeared in the documentary 2 years later, 2019, and stated, quote, "A friend from LVMPD called, stating they needed to use our armored personnel carriers. They then provided them to the police." One of the male survivors who appeared in the documentary said, quote, "I believe it was a sniper's paradise because you had several tall buildings all facing down at a central low area with no cover." The Baltimore Post-Examiner broke the story that MGM Resorts International, who owns the Mandalay Bay Hotel, along with the FBI and the LVMPD, were all fully aware of the threat posed by a sniper attack from an elevated position in a hotel high-rise tower years before the massacre. I updated my original Baltimore Post-Examiner story on August 9, 2021, in episode 59 of this podcast, titled Las Vegas Massacre, FBI, LVMPD, MGMRI knew sniper attack posed a threat prior to 2017. Apparently, nothing was learned from that training scenario, as it was ignored in the pre-planning stages for the Route 91 Music Festival, as was the 2014 incident when a convicted felon brought an arsenal of weapons into a room in one of the high-rise towers at the Mandalay Bay Hotel and had a high-powered rifle pointed to a window overlooking the Las Vegas Strip, according to court records that I obtained. To date, the FBI has not released any of their forensic analysis reports on any of the evidence, including the results of the examination of the bullets that were recovered from victims, survivors, and the concert area. Were they all matched as having been fired from the firearms seized in the rooms? Who knows? Fox News did a good job on the documentary as far as the human interest story goes. That being said, I was disappointed because their investigative approach fell short. The October 1st, 2017 Las Vegas Massacre should never have happened. I said that numerous times over and over again when I was writing my stories for the Baltimore Post-Examiner, and backed up what I said. It was the result, ladies and gentlemen, of complacency, ignorance, and incompetence on behalf of MGM Resorts International and the police. Failed police leadership and political correctness resulted in a lack of preparedness on the night of October 1st, 2017. With all the millions of dollars that run through Las Vegas in one day, it was a tragedy in itself that it took the death of 58 people that night and the wounding of hundreds of others to implement measures that should have been in place prior to the Las Vegas Massacre. That's a very nice resume for Sheriff Lombardo, who wants to be governor of Nevada, and Kevin McMahill, who wants to be the top law enforcement official in Clark County, Nevada. Both of these guys, ladies and gentlemen, are documented liars. Their credibility is in the sewer. When I wrote that story back in 2019, I stated that I had received inquiries from survivors and family members of the victims of the Route 91 Harvest Music Festival, questioning why former Nevada District Court Judge Jennifer Tagliati, who retired earlier in 2019, was one of the mediators who was involved with the civil lawsuit mediation between attorneys for MGM Resorts International and attorneys for the victims of the Route 91 Harvest Music Festival. What was the concern, you may ask? Well, Jennifer Tagliati, as I reported, is the daughter of George Tagliati, who was a retired FBI special agent, and listen to this, and was the vice president of security, surveillance, and safety at the Mandalay Bay Hotel during the night of the Las Vegas Massacre. And yes, his daughter was involved in the mediation. That just didn't sit right with a lot of people. Thanks for listening, folks, and remember to subscribe to my YouTube channel by hitting the red subscribe button. It doesn't cost anything. In upcoming episodes, I will be exposing more of Joe Lombardo and Kevin McMahill's cover-ups. You will not hear these exclusive investigative news stories in the Las Vegas media.